This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
How uncomfortable did the silence make you feel?
Not uncomfortable, but I was waiting for something big to happen.
And like yell?
Yeah, I thought you were going to yell into the mic, so I was kind of like bracing. Love that.
Don't do that sound to me.
Yeah. Like a pterodactyl.
Those nails on a chalkboard.
But no, that was a clicker sound.
Oh.
Oh, God.
I'm traumatized from 4.5 hours of playing Last of Us last night, starting midnight.
Okay.
I like knew clicker and I was like, what game is that from? And I was like, and then when she said, I was like, there we go. Last of Us.
First one came out.
That's it.
The remake of the first one came out last night.
Did you know? Oh, Lord. I believe we're going here. I don't know how to whistle. I thought I did for like 30 years.
Is that your whistle?
No, that's my trying to make everyone feel uncomfortable.
So is it a new life goal to learn how to whistle, or?
I don't know. I don't know how much I really care. But like my whole life, like I've heard people like whistling tunes. I'm like, how did they do that?
Don't you need it for Grizzlies games? The obnoxiously loud fingers in your whistle, you know?
No, I'm not that into it. I just yell. I growl.
That works.
Love it.
You grizzle.
A grizzle. That's it.
That's it.
There's that. And then also tweeted out this sweet picture of Andrew wearing the jersey he's wearing right now that has a PayPal logo. And I covered it with a Stripe logo and sent it to CJ. And then someone from PayPal's DevRel team responded. And I was like, oh no, I feel like the worst.
It's been a good morning for me.
It was so uncomfortable.
I thought that was so funny.
I bet you did.
Yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
I'm batting 0 for 60 this week.
Yeah. Well, I didn't tell you this, but this weekend I'm going skydiving.
Okay.
Wire transition.
Have you been before?
No, I haven't.
I have a lot of friends who are like really into it. They go like live at the drop zone.
Oh, that's cool.
Throughout the season and stuff. Yeah, they have trailers and stuff there.
I went once in Germany and we almost died. So that'll probably be my last time. I don't know how many feet we were in the air, but then the plane just like...
Would it be kilometers? Because you were in Germany?
Yeah, it was metric time as well.
Yeah.
So I don't know how many minutes that was. But yeah, we were like really high up in the air getting into the clouds. And then we like veer to the right really hard. And we're all just kind of like, I guess this is normal, like whatever. And there's actually a plane that we almost crashed into. It was like in the clouds that came out and we were like really close to them, but it all went well. I don't like heights. So skydiving was an experience. I won't do it again, but it was fun.
That sounds terrible. But
it was just mostly a crap load of adrenaline. As soon as you get in the plane and they turn it on, you're like, this is happening. There's not going back now.
I was looking for adrenaline. What's the closest I can get to dying without dying this weekend? I was like, skydiving sounds fun.
Push directly to Maine.
Yeah. Oh, shoot. Maybe I should do that before I log off.
That's how I get my adrenaline.
Push a bad change to Maine and then go skydiving and not come back. That's my exit plan.
Oh, Lord. You would do that.
Anyway.
Go for it.
This week on the show, we are joined by Joel Drapper. Joel, welcome to the show. You want to give a little introduction?
Hey, yeah. I'm Joel Drapper. I am the author of a new view component library that is basically trying to see if we can move all of the views into Ruby, basically. So you can build and compose views without moving outside of the Ruby language.
Awesome. And that library is called Flex. And I'm sure anyone on Twitter who has been following you has seen it because I've been following along closely and that's how I began to follow you. And I think it's super cool.
Thanks. Yeah, it's important to remember it's Flex with a PH instead of an F.
Absolutely.
Flex on it.
Which was basically chosen because it was just the first name that I could find on Ruby Gems that was short and could be followed by component and wasn't taken, basically.
We've all been there. We've all been there.
Got into the Ruby scene too late.
Yeah.
I'm curious what led you to creating Flex? What problems are you trying to solve with it?
I created it really to solve my own problem, which was I was trying to make a different library, which is yet to come, which is basically, I think, kind of Bootstrap, but built with Tailwind so that you can extend it with your own components quite easily if you're using the Tailwind utility classes. So I started trying to build this using Rails partials and quickly ran into issues with just the partials were so complicated. Like using Tailwind classes, you want to break everything down into really small components. So there would be everything you could see on a page would be considered a component pretty much. And Rails partials don't accept arguments or anything like that. Or like they don't have a way of declaring what arguments they accept very well. And it just wasn't really working. And I looked into various options. I looked into view component as an option. And I kind of just didn't like the fact that with view component, you have the class and then you have a separate template file. And I wanted to see if it would be possible to try to just build a template in Ruby. And so I basically wrote the code that I wanted to be able to use. I wrote a class and I called it like my component. And then I defined a method that was called template and kind of just imagined that I could just write HTML directly in my template and pass in arguments, methods, instance variables into those HTML tags. And then I was like, I wonder if I can get this to work, and spent some time basically doing that.
That's dope. I was in a similar position not long ago. Well, it's been a while now, but I tried to rewrite Bootstrap with Tailwind and make it into a gem that you could just install. And I got bored with it, but I went the view component path and just started trying to use the tag helpers and got really meta programmy. And I eventually fell out of interest of making it something that I could ship, but I still use like that concept when building components. So I think for anyone who has used the tag and the content tag helpers, it's not always an amazing experience. You run into weird things. Sometimes you have to concatenate things when you're trying to nest, especially with the tag helpers. So when I saw your library, I was like, I love this.
Awesome. There's no context switching in the code as well as in your own mind. You don't have to think, okay, now I'm moving from my ERB file into Ruby because I've got these tags and I need to like think about now I'm writing in a different language in the same file. So I find that just makes it a lot easier to work with. Ruby is an amazing language and it's actually amazing for writing views because all the things that we do to make Ruby code really nice and easy to work with, like breaking down a method into smaller methods, you can do that. Your template method can say like, if this, then call this method, otherwise call this other method. And those methods can just define the HTML markup that they want to produce. And so you can kind of embed into a Flex component these kind of mini partials that are just methods that do one very small thing. So it's pretty powerful. And I think, it's just kind of happened, if that makes sense.
What is like the testing story? Because I know that's like something everyone wants to talk about with View Component, which I could take it or leave it, but everyone, when they're like, oh, View Component, you can test it. That's why it's so good.
Before we get there, I've heard people say that. Still don't see a lot of these view tests, even in View Component.
So I think the idea of being able to test a view in isolation means that I don't know why you couldn't achieve the same thing with a partial. I think you probably could quite easily, like just render a partial and test that. So I don't know if View Component has extra special things around that other than just rendering out some HTML and then inspecting it. But testing a component in Flex would basically just be a case of rendering it into HTML and then using, I think there's various different testing libraries for RSpec and Minitest that let you assert things about the HTML produced using CSS selectors and things like that.
Yeah, Capybara.
Yeah, but you don't actually need to build an entire web page. I think that's the benefit that you get is you can just say like, I want to test just this one button, and that makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you've been talking about this a lot on Twitter. What has kind of the reception been like?
It's been pretty good. I think it's still pretty early days. There's no one using it at the moment, really, aside from we're using it for our own documentation. That's the only live website that is currently built using Flex. So I don't really know how to answer that. There's been a lot of interest, at least for me. This is the first open source library that I've actually had some interest in, if that makes sense, from other people.
Yeah.
I built a few other things before, but it's had a lot of interest from the people that built MateStack and Vue Component themselves, the team at Vue Component. So yeah, it's pretty exciting. I think just be cool to see where it goes. We don't even have a beta yet. I'm not comfortable releasing a beta version of it until I feel like it could be a pretty good stand-in for the entire application view layer. And we're not quite there with the story around Rails helpers yet.
The other day, I was stalking Jared White on GitHub because that's just a thing I do. And he has created it was probably just like a little bit of Ruby to like make sure it works, but he made a proof of concept of using Flex in Bridgetown to make your components.
Yeah.
So this weekend, I was like, okay, I want to do that. So I started looking into like, okay, how can I start translating some of these Vue components into Flex components? Whenever, if ever, I ever launch the updated website that is now over 200 commits deep in a private fork, that will be live using Flex components.
Oh, awesome. How far have you got?
Not into the sense of the whole thing is now using it, but I've like I copied the way Jared was doing it to like make it work for Bridgetown. Yeah. And it was like, okay, now it works. So now I can start thinking about how would I start translating some of this stuff over, and like what specifically would be really good to transfer over. Potentially some things might stay in Vue component for XYZ reasons I don't know yet. So I'm kind of in that like exploratory phase of like, all right, now that I've got it working, what can I do with it?
One of the things that I think will be really interesting to try to put across in the documentation, which is still very much under construction, is there are a few really interesting patterns that you can use in Flex that you kind of get for free just by the fact that it's Ruby. One of them that I think is really powerful is basically the ability to like yielding the content of a component, but the component can yield itself to the block of content. So that means that say you have a tabs component, and I define my tabs component by saying like class tabs inherits from Flex component, and I define an initializer. Actually, I don't know if it would need an initializer, but I define the template method and it creates like a tabs div or something like that. I can then, inside that div, I can yield self. And when I'm using that component, I can say render tabs.new do, and then I can take the argument like t, and then I can call t.tab. And if I go back to my tabs component and I define the method tab, I can make that tab take a block and output the source code required for a single tab. So for example, the tab might take as its first argument the name of the tab, and then a block for its content. And so I've kind of produced a component that has this interface just by defining a method and yielding self to, if that makes sense. Like it's really hard to describe that without showing it. But when you realize how easy it is to do that a component, just by defining a method, can provide essentially its own DSL back to whatever's calling it, it's just so powerful what you can do. Yep. Like you could imagine a nav component. You could say do n, and then you say n.item, and you give it the name of the nav item or something. And maybe it takes the argument active true or something. There are so many possibilities.
It sounds like a really nice composability feature that you get with it.
Yeah.
And that's what I love with components. So one thing that I've been seeing and what I got really interested to have you on the show about was you've been doing a lot of performance stuff with it. And so every week I look back at your Twitter and you're like, this week I improved the library by X amount.
Right.
And I just want to know how. I just want to kind of get into like what you're kind of doing, how you're making those benchmarks, and like how you're kind of figuring out these performance things.
So this is really interesting. I feel like I should kind of go back a bit and say, when I started this library, I was pretty convinced that I would have to sacrifice performance for developer experience. I was like pretty definitely convinced that I would have to do that. When I started the library, every single element, like HTML element that you created, was an object in Ruby. And it was pretty expensive and it was pretty slow. But over time, it's basically turned out that I think we're going to be able to achieve equal performance to a language like Haml, which is completely compiled. We don't have a compiler yet, but I can manually compile any component. And I know that I can make a script that will be able to take a component and do exactly what I'm doing manually. And the performance of those when benchmarked against something like Haml is exactly the same because they're essentially running the same code. But there's also been this journey of trying to optimize the kind of dynamic version of the components. There might be situations where it doesn't make sense to compile, or the compiler like can't compile certain things. For example, calls to external methods that then do things. And I also didn't want to have a compiler kind of do anything to change the language at all. In React, like a React component actually breaks the JavaScript language. You can't just put strings inside a method like you do in React components. And so they have to be compiled in order to work. In Flex, I wanted it to be that everything is like completely valid Ruby. You don't have to have a step where your code is transformed into some different code before it's executed. You can execute it exactly as it is. And that's going to be like the kind of standard by which we measure everything against. The compiler has to match what the dynamic version will do. So with that aside, knowing that that was coming, I kind of just put that on hold and started working on like, how can we improve the dynamic version? I don't really know how to describe how I do it. We created some benchmarks and we just run them every time we tweak something. And you read the code again and again and again and again, and you look for things that you might be able to avoid doing. Maybe I don't need this intermediary object. Maybe I can use the mutating method rather than a method that duplicates an object. And it's just lots and lots of very small changes. Most of them just add up over time. I went back and I checked the first benchmark, or like taking our new benchmark back to when we first introduced benchmarks. And since then, through the process of, I think about 16 or 17 pull requests directly addressing performance, we've done like 7 times performance improvement. But I don't know, I can't really point to any specific technique except just reading it again and again and trying things and seeing what works.
What's been like the most interesting thing that you've tried or found out? Oh, I tried this thing and I had no idea and it made it a bunch better. Is there any like specific thing you can point out?
There are a few really easy ones. For example, switching our HTML escaper to CGI instead of ERB utils. That was just something that we could be like, oh, there's another one that we could try and see which one's faster. That was pretty simple. The one that had the biggest impact was completely reworking what happens when you call a tag method. So the way that it used to work is we would build up this tree of tag objects in Ruby. And then when you wanted to render that tree, you would basically go through all of those objects and call them all, and they would render to a string just that object. So just that HTML element would render, and it would kind of then join all of those together. So a really significant change was moving from that to basically just having a single string buffer, which is just a string that you mutate. And that string is passed around. So every time you do something, you just add things to the end of the string. And the really cool thing about Ruby is you can add things to a string and then you can yield a block, and then you can add things to the string after that. So you get the ability to do this nesting, but with just a single string. So that was a really big one. There've been a few other, like just noticing that a lot of the time, the attributes that we put on HTML tags are the same, or they're repeated a number of times. So like my attributes might be like class equals tab, and that's repeated, 50 times on a page. So attributes are provided as keyword arguments to the tag methods. The method receives them as a hash, and hashes actually have a hash themselves. So we keep track the first time you render any component, we keep a track of all of the full attribute strings that have been created. And then the next time you render that component, we can check whether you're rendering the same attributes. And if you are, we don't need to go through and like transform them into a string. We can just grab the string out of the cache. It's just really small things like moving from using a technique where we would alias method and then check the caller to instead having a macro that basically creates a method for each HTML tag. That was like a 40% performance improvement just the other day. After spending weeks working on it, there was just another 40% performance improvement just waiting there that I somehow just never saw before. I don't know. It's really hard to describe it as a process. And it's also really weird for me because this is the first time I've ever done this. I've always tried to write code that is definitely prioritizing readability and human understanding than computer understanding. But I think because of where this library sits, because it's going to be like every performance improvement that we make to a tag is done thousands of times per page. And then for every page on every app that uses it. So it's like multiplied so much that I think it's worth writing some ugly code sometimes.
No, that's cool.
I just want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Honey Badger. They are not only my favorite error and uptime monitoring service, but they've also added several awesome new features. One of those being the public status pages. So it makes perfect sense that your error and uptime monitoring tool can have a public status page for you to communicate any downtime outages with your customers. So whether US East 1 is down or you forgot to add a configuration file, Honey Badger is there for you to help communicate any downtime or outages with your customers. Plus, they've also added SSL certificate monitoring. So like many of us use these days, Let's Encrypt certificates expire every 90 days. And if for some reason you're a week away from expiring an SSL certificate, they could let you know ahead of time so that you can take care of it without any outages for your customers. Plus, managing the errors and things inside of Honey Badger has gotten even easier with Honey Badger Actions, which you can use to automatically assign errors to yourself or another team member, add tags to different error classes, and more. And they also have batch actions, which you can use on the search results to help manage your backlog of work to do. So Honey Badger is the place to check out for error and uptime monitoring, and it's only getting better. So check them out at honeybadger.io.
You definitely got me like thinking about some things of like, oh yeah, maybe sometimes I don't need to like make a new object. Why do I feel like I need to make a new object when I could just mutate it?
Right.
That's some interesting stuff to think about when you're writing code in your normal apps. If it does add to the readability at the sake of performance, maybe you need to make that decision of, okay, what's more important right here? And maybe that differs across different parts of your application.
Yeah. I can think of a really good example of something that I don't think is a very smart thing to do in like application code, but we've decided to do in Flex, which is we have this optimization in the generated tag methods. So a tag method might be something like p or div or article or h1. And basically what the tag method does is it adds the opening tag. So less than the tag name. So less than symbol, h1, and then the attributes for that tag, then the greater than symbol, and then it yields, and then it does less than / tag name, greater than symbol to close the tag. But sometimes when you use a tag, you don't provide attributes. So that means that we can actually pre-generate a string that is less than tag name, greater than, already concatenated together. We don't have to say less than, then tag name, then are there attributes or not? Because we can instead like kind of flip it around and say, if there are no attributes, just output this whole string, and you can save a concatenation there, if that makes sense. Or like content as well. If the tag is empty, we can save a concatenation of the closing tag. We have a single string that is the opening tag and the closing tag all at once. That just wouldn't make sense to write your code like that most of the time. It's just really silly, and you should let the compiler do that or the interpreter do that. But for us, it kind of makes sense.
That's really interesting. What are you kind of focused on now, like moving forward? What's happening for Flex in the next few months?
I'm focused at the moment on trying to get Flex to a point where I can release a beta version, which is basically, I want it to be enough that you could start using it in a production environment. It's going to have the features that are really essential to building an application, forms and things like that. And it's going to be stable enough that you could start testing it if you were willing to, if you run into a bug, maybe try and fix it. So getting to that point, basically all that's left on the feature side is better integration with Rails helpers. Rails helpers are quite tricky because in Flex, there's like a big difference between helpers that return a string to be used as like a value for an attribute or content for a tag, and helpers that append onto that buffer because they're creating tags themselves. So if you think about the URL helper, that is returning a string that should be the href or the link to value. Whereas the form helper is actually creating a form tag and it's creating an input tag. And in the latter case, things like a form with should really be a Flex component. And so basically I'm going through reading the Rails API and trying to build kind of counterpart to form with that is like actually a Flex component itself, but has all the features of form with essentially. I don't know how long that's going to take. I don't know how many of those helpers there are. I think it's mainly forms. And then the other thing is basically just documentation, putting together enough documentation that people can just get started and like do everything they need to do without jumping in Discord and asking for help necessarily, which is a process. There's just so much to document and I'm not very good at writing.
Whenever I get to the documentation of projects, sometimes I'm like, maybe I won't ship this.
Yeah. What's kind of helped me has been actually writing the documentation in Flex, because that's been kind of a fun way to experiment with Flex. And also like, because we're in this environment where we have Flex right there, the documentation is built in a way that it actually executes the code examples to produce the output that we show you that you should expect. So that's been quite fun to build. But like actually writing it,
oh yeah,
it's like
sure.
one of those things I keep procrastinating.
So you said this was your first big open source project.
Yeah. First with over 100 stars.
Have you had any contributors? Are you looking for contributors? What's the kind of story with the open source side of it?
There's been a few people who have contributed with pull request feedback or like a few code contributions. Alexander Ruben in particular has done a lot of contributions, particularly around reviewing pull requests. I actually asked if he could be an actual contributor on the project so that I could tag him in my PRs and have a second pair of eyes. But also there's just been like loads of people jumping in on Discord and helping out with suggestions and ideas and helping to solve various problems, particularly around the interface, naming things and like how things should work. So it's like a lot of people have been helping. And also I should mention the team at View Component invited me to join their weekly office hours chat. And they have been amazing in terms of giving context of running a View Component system. Like they know all the problems that could come up and they know how to test the boundaries of a View Component system. And so that has been really, really helpful.
That's cool. I remember when we were having the discussion about specifically about Discord, when we were wanting to build a community around Stimulus Reflex. And I would suggest for anyone, because we were like, should we create Discourse? Should we do Discord? And at the time, there weren't a lot of gems who were trying to build a community. And now I see it a lot more. And it makes me happy because I often tell newer developers who are like, how do I get started? I'm like, go find a gem you like and join their community if they have one.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I love to see that you're doing that.
I think that's a really good advice. I realized just now that I actually accidentally removed this from the README, but my other gems in their README have a link to my SavvyCal page where people can schedule a session to like pair with me on any of my open source stuff. And the idea is that it's really, really hard to start contributing to a new library. There's so much context that you need to pick up before you can make any meaningful contributions. And that could be particularly hard in a library like Flex because the code is so weird in really weird ways. All the performance stuff basically is just like writing code in a way that doesn't make any sense unless you know that it's for a performance reason. So I think letting people book a pairing session with the maintainer, because I'm working on it a lot anyway, and having someone pair with me just makes it even more productive. So that's been good. And a few people have taken me up on that.
That's awesome to hear. I have another podcast called Ruby for All. And the other day we were talking about getting started with open source. And that was one thing I was like, if the maintainer is active and you're trying to help out, maybe see if they'll pair with you.
Yeah.
So that's so awesome that you're doing that. And like even take so far as going to the initiative of being like, hey, here's the link if you want to pair with me.
Yeah. And it's a short session initially because like I don't want to go too deep on stuff. It's basically just a good way to hear like what they want to do and then maybe try to offer some advice in terms of an overview of showing them the ropes. Basically, here's how it works. These are the important bits and this is why. And also, what's the feature you wanted to work on? And can I give you some advice on how to start doing that? Which file should that live in? What are some things you need to think about? And I think you can get that across really easily in like a 20-minute, 30-minute pairing session. So I think as long as that's not too overwhelming, the specific SavvyCal link that I've got is set to like only allow I think 2 or 3 sessions a week. And I think it's really cool that you can just set that. And if there's no sessions available, then just check back like next week and see if another session has become available. But it like kind of allows me to manage that commitment, I guess.
Nice. So the other day we were talking on Twitter and someone asked, I'm a junior, should I learn Flex?
Yeah.
And I thought your response was interesting. So if I'm a junior, should I learn Flex?
Yeah, I think that you should, but I'm definitely very biased. I think that you should learn it because you'll learn a lot of good Ruby by learning Flex to start with. Flex is a really good way to understand how cool Ruby blocks are and like how they can be used. And I think actually writing a component that yields self and provides an interface to another component that's using it is like a really simple and, I don't know, beginner friendly introduction to blocks, if that makes sense. So for that reason alone, definitely check it out. But also I think the reason I'm working on it is because I think that it's providing a superior developer experience. It's also going to provide really, really good performance. And as far as I'm aware, pretty good security. So yeah, I think you should definitely check it out. But you should also check out the other stuff that's out there, especially if you want to get a job. And like View component is obviously used by hundreds of companies. And then Action View, plain old Action View partials is used even more. So I would learn those other systems as well.
Yeah, my take on it is that I'm very happy to see Rails teams moving more and more into component spaces. I mean, it's already where a lot of other ecosystems are. I think it's the future for us as well. I love building with components. So in my opinion, like regardless of whether it's Vue component or Flex or one of the other ones, learning to develop with components and building UIs with components and thinking about component architecture, I think is valuable regardless of maybe the exact way you learn it. So I agree that you should definitely check out and learn the other stuff. But essentially, if you start learning how to build components and, you know, how to build a good component and what's a bad component and learning like the pitfalls and how you can compose them in your views so that they're actually reusable, I think that can take you really far.
I mean, components are just classes. And so writing views using components is basically writing object-oriented views, which is just really good to learn.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I've enjoyed following the story of Flex on Twitter. I especially paid attention when you started saying like, oh, I'm going to like try and just make it faster. Because it wasn't like, oh, I have this grand plan of how I'm going to do it. You tweeted something like, yeah, I'm just going to see. And then you're like, okay, well, this went well. And it was like majorly like a huge X improvement. Yeah. So it's fun to follow. So I enjoy it.
I keep surprising myself because every time I do it, I'm like, this has got to be the last one. I've read this code 1,000 times. This has got to be the last one. There isn't anything else we can do. There's nothing we can cut. And then a few days later, I find another 20% and then another 40% and then another 10% on top of that. It's just insane. I think I'm now at the limit. But every time I found another one, I think I'm at the limit. Yeah, maybe there's some more we can do, but I think it's pretty close now.
You're going to be writing a C extension next.
Actually, you joke about that. I've been talking with Cameron from GitHub about a C extension for a new type of string that he's been working on, which uses some concepts from Truffle Ruby. I think it was called ropes and it's now called truffle string or something like that. I think you basically create a linked list of all the parts of the string rather than adding them together. And for certain things like what we're doing, it's faster to do that because we don't have to do the things that would make that technique slower.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
So there may well be a C extension for a special type of string that we use as our buffer instead sometimes.
And then you're going to optimize it with a little bit of raw assembly and you're going to be going down the rabbit hole forever.
I think the next big one is once I've got all the features to a point where I'm happy to release 1.0 and let people use it, because I think it's fast enough, I'm going to spend some time working on the compiler. And basically what that's going to do is it's going to use syntax tree to look at the code for your components. And it's going to try to replace what method calls to tags with instead just inlining what it expects those method calls to produce as a string shovel append. And if you do that manually, you get 10 times performance on your components.
Dang.
But yeah, trying to do it automatically is going to be hard, but I think it'll be worth it.
Like Jason said, I really enjoy following along and seeing the behind the scenes optimizations and just decision making and stuff. Building stuff like that is fun because you can use the library and that gives you a perspective on it, which is great. But seeing all of the decisions that made it the way that it is and how you make it faster and whatever, like I really enjoy that, and seeing those things give me ideas for other things I can apply to my own stuff. And it was a lot of fun to follow along on your progress here on Flex. So
thanks. That's awesome. What's really interesting about it is basically we haven't changed the features at all. The benchmark that we run today, aside from one word, is identical. We can take the very benchmark that we run today and run it on the one that the first commit where we introduced the benchmark, and all the features are the same. The interface is the same. Everything works exactly the same as it did then. It's just 7 times faster today than it was. And like through the process of 16 PRs or something like that, they just do a really small thing. So that's kind of interesting case study, I think.
Cool. Well, Joel, where can people find you online? Plug whatever you want to plug.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter. I am at Joel Drapper, which is like Draper, but with 2 Ps. I'm obviously on GitHub, same username. Basically, I'm on everything with that username, pretty much. So I haven't done an episode for a really long time because of life things that have come up. But I also do a show called Naming Things, which is basically a video show. They're really long, not for everyone, 2-hour sessions of pair programming or something, which you might want to check out. And that's namingthings.org. Definitely promise there will be new episodes eventually once life calms down.
Cool. Joel, thank you for coming on the show.
You're welcome. It's been great.
Thanks for joining us. This was a lot of fun.